it's happening in America, which is the place they went to escape all of this.
Yeah.
That's supposed to be their safe haven. That's supposed to be the place where they were not being pursued. And yet, not just this occasion, but previously, as Sarah says, that's where they felt unsafe.
Went on.
Well, I can try and piece together as much as we know, but as you say, there are a lot of questions outstanding around this. Last night, Harry, Meghan and Doria Ragland, Meghan's mother, were attending the Women of Vision gala at the Ziegfeld Theatre in New York. Meghan was picking up an award. Just after 10 o'clock, they left. It was a well-publicised event, so there was a lot of paparazzi outside that event. They were accompanied by private security, and they were heading back to a private residence that they were staying in on the Upper East Side. That was the plan. They didn't want, according to sources in New York, the paparazzi to know where they were staying. They didn't want them to follow them, so they tried to lose them. They were driven up and down FDR Drive for about an hour and a quarter, followed by paparazzi in cars and potentially on motorbikes as well. They were being escorted by one NYPD vehicle. Then they went to the NYPD precinct, the 19th precinct, where they switched cars with the assistance of the police, and they got into a taxi, and then they eventually made their way home. It was described as chaotic. The NYPD have described it as challenging. They said that there were numerous photographers that made their transport challenging. Duke and Duchess of Sussex arrived at their destination, and there were no reported collisions, summonses, injuries or arrests in regard. So we've got a bit of a difference in terms of the two versions of this story and how dramatic it was. We've also been hearing from the taxi driver, who apparently was hailed by the security guard and asked, "Do you want a fare?" and took them for 10 minutes and said they were followed, but he felt safe at all times. One of the security detail saying that he felt that he was worried about the risk to them, but he was also worried about bystanders, pedestrians, for example. So there are a lot of questions.
There are. I mean, New York taxi drivers are a pretty tough breed, by the way. It probably takes quite a lot to rattle a New York yellow cab driver. Maybe it depends on whose eyes you're looking at what happened through. In fact, we're all nodding at that. That seems to make a certain amount of sense. What seemed to be going on from inside that car through the eyes of Harry after what happened? Memories of his mother, and maybe Meghan and her mum saw things a certain way. Maybe others saw it differently. It does sound like it was a bit of a mess on the roads, though. The New York mayor, Sarah, talking about reckless behaviour and talking about the risk to life.
Yes, and I think we have to look at it through the prism of what Harry has experienced. And we know that he holds the paparazzi responsible for that car crash in the Alma Tunnel in Paris, for the pursuit of her vehicle and ultimately the crash that led to her death. In the Netflix documentary, we saw a scene where Harry and Meghan were in New York and they felt they were being chased by paparazzi again. So it is a massive issue for him. He has talked of his greatest fear being history repeating itself. He wants, above all, to be able to protect his wife. But I think there are also questions for the security about the decision to drive up and down FDR for an hour and a quarter, if that's proved to be true, whether that really was the right course of action to try and evade photographers.
What Paul and you, Cat, make of all of this? Because I think, lots of questions are going to be thrown now from different directions, very different questions, depending on the perspective of the person asking the question. But this is ultra-sensitive stuff for those in the car, for the media, but for the public and the country here generally.
Yeah, I mean, you already kind of see stuff on social media with sort of people taking both sides and a lot of vitriol immediately before we even actually know any of the facts. And of course, the backdrop is, the lawsuits that are happening at the minute as well, and tensions being quite high. And as Sarah says, it kind of really struck me because in the interviews that Harry has done, where he talks about sort of trying to relive going through the tunnel where his mother died and actually driving through that to see what it was like himself. I think we might have spoken about it on this programme before. He's clearly deeply traumatised by it and cannot shake that and that feeling that history will repeat itself. And so it's quite chilling actually to think, that this is something that he's had to go through.
I think what's really interesting is that it's happening in America, which is the place they went to escape all of this.
Yeah.
That's supposed to be their safe haven. That's supposed to be the place where they were not being pursued. And yet, not just this occasion, but previously, as Sarah says, that's where they felt unsafe. There is obviously... The media here will counter that. Actually, look, when they were here, we had a pretty decent arrangement. We all agreed that there would be no paps, there would be no real intrusion. Certainly, when it came as far as the kids, those are the rules of the game now. Ever since Diana died, and largely, by and large, most of the media have stuck to that. And they will say, well, actually, this is a bit of the Wild West out there.
Yeah.
The big problem with that is certain websites already had some of those pap shots up on British media, and they pulled them down within the last few hours, obviously very, very nervous about any backlash. So listeners listening to this conversation might think, well, what were these paps doing? What are the shots they've taken? You won't see them on British media because of that sensitivity.
Yeah, I mean, earlier on I had a really interesting conversation with Stig Abel, who in a previous life, before Times Radio and other roles that he's performed, was a press regulator. He was part of that, and he knew a lot about the way the press operate, not just in this country, but in America too. And Wild West, I think that was pretty much the phrase that he used when it comes to the paparazzi in America. What is published, what is able to be published in America is a very different bar, lower bar than it is in this country. You're nodding, Sarah. And it's a different climate altogether.
And it's interesting because Prince Harry has been very critical of the relationship between the palace and the press and the Royal Rota, which is set up in order to have a fewer number of photographers, camera crews and journalists at each event, and then that information is shared. And that was set up in order to protect particularly the children on big occasions, that they weren't subjected to this huge barrage of photographers in front of them. Prince Harry, we know, does not like that arrangement and what he sees as the closeness of the relationship between the palace and the press. And they have moved to the United States to try and get away from some of that press intrusion. And yet we see these scenes on the streets of New York that just wouldn't be able to happen in this country now.
I do wonder, I mean, Cat and Paul and you, Sarah, as all experienced journalists, in this field and in the case of us in politics, but the question's a good one. Will an incident like this, guys, change the way the thing operates? I mean, from the conversation so far, you think probably not, actually, because in this case, people are going to be saying, look, this is America. You know what they're like over there. We've got a different set of standards over here. Would it make anyone think again? What do you think?
Well, I'm kind of always reminded of the fact that after the death of Princess Diana, there was a huge kind of attack on the press. But it was a lot of the time, it was from people who wanted to read the very magazines that they were taking the pictures for. So there is a kind of circular argument here, which is that, people are consuming that media and the press wouldn't do it if they weren't selling those papers and magazines. All the while there is that kind of demand for pictures of them sort of travelling around, which, is not something that I'm personally interested in, but lots of other people are. I suspect it's probably not likely to change all that much. And as you say, the American system is so different.
Well, the tragedy of Princess Diana also happened overseas. So that raised the question of the market, as well as those providing the product, the pictures.
And actually, in the statement that was released from the Sussex spokesperson, they talked about the dissemination of the images, as you raised, Paul, and that if you disseminate those images, given the way they're obtained, you are playing a role in encouraging that sort of reckless behaviour, as they describe it.
I think there is a parallel as well. That's obviously the undertone of this with Princess Diana, which is, don't forget, she was driven by a driver who actually, wasn't a professional security guard, wasn't
capable at the time.
Wasn't capable. And, there's a parallel here, which is, can you really trust these private security guards? As Sarah rightly said, there's no way the cops in the UK or Royal Security here would ever drive up and down to try and lose paps. They would have alternative methods. We won't go into them, but they are very, very experienced at losing people. And, it just raises the question that, maybe Harry was right. He shouldn't have had his security withdrawn. But at the same time, if you're going to rely on the people, they've got to be the right people.